This episode of Shadiversity is brought to you by my stupendous, awesome, legendary supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to support Shadiversity on Patreon, visit patreon.com/Shadiversity. You know, sometimes there are topics that come up that no matter what you say on the matter, you're still going to lose subscribers as a result. And so some people might say, just don't talk about those things. But I'm not that type of person. Let's do this.
Shadiversity.
Greetings, I'm Shad, and I've had a lot of requests from a certain number of my viewers asking to hear my thoughts on the anime Goblin Slayer. And those requests have not died down, even though the major wave of controversy has kind of moved on. People are still asking to hear what I think about it. Yet I'm sure there are many of you who have no idea what Goblin Slayer is. So I guess you're going to find out about it in this video. Goblin Slayer is an anime adapted from a manga which seems to purposefully deconstruct certain elements of the fantasy genre, which is what makes it such great fodder for me to review, because in my general fantasy rearmed videos, I'm always talking about taking a different look to fantasy, usually a far more realistic approach to it, which will then make it more immersive, more engaging, and also a little bit fresh and new, especially when we disregard tropes for the sake of being tropes and have a look at how realistic and plausible they would be. Well, in this instance, Goblin Slayer is a type of anime or property that has actually done that, where the creators have looked at something and reconstructed and taken a different approach. So this isn't a fantasy rearmed of me saying, what if you did this, but more, it's a review of what someone else has done, shaking up certain elements in the fantasy genre. Of course, for those of you who know what Goblin Slayer is, there's a big elephant in the room regarding this topic that of course I need to address probably first and foremost, but it's so interrelated into this reconstruction, or I guess this different take on the fantasy genre, and it's really how this, fantasy story looks at monsters, specifically, funnily enough, goblins. And it's the fact that goblins in Goblin Slayer, and I'll try and avoid the word for demonetization issues, not that, I think we should avoid the word because it's scary, but they impregnate women as a mean, or to describe how they reproduce. Now, this concept, or using this element in fantasy, well, first of all, it's nothing new, okay? So, I'm going to look at the idea of monsters in fantasy just generally and apply it to Goblin Slayer a bit, and I'll be talking about the fact that you want them to be monstrous and explore the reasons why. But so many writers have actually understood this, and the implementation of this element is nothing new in fantasy. In fact, it's actually been around for quite a while. I'm not saying that they should keep this element out of the fantasy at all. In actual fact, I think the idea of implementing it answers a very big plot hole that has existed in regards to the goblin monster for a very long time, and for that sense, I think it works really well in the sense that it makes them so much more evil and monstrous, and the stakes are higher. It makes these monsters far more monstrous, which is what you would want with monsters. Yet with the anime, there is really one pose specifically that I feel is too sexualized. Some people won't feel that way. They'll think, no, that's just, anime being anime, or it actually isn't sexualized, it's very disturbing and other things like that. And yes, it is very disturbing, and how could you find something like that arousing? Not me, but there are a lot of people who do find that thing. There's a whole subset of anime, certain elements of, well, I don't even want to say that word because of demonetization, that really get off on that type of thing. So even though we might not get off on it, there are a lot of people who do, and I'm sure appreciate that pose in Goblin Slayer as well. It could have been taken out and they could have had the monstrous element in, and it would have fulfilled the purpose they wanted to do. Now, it does not show this scene explicitly happening. It is alluded to very clearly. There is a close-up of, the character's face when she is being impregnated. But that close-up is horrifying, okay? It's disturbing, which is really what you want in terms of showing how evil these monsters are. There is so much vitriol, because I looked up reviews and everything about Goblin Slayer before making this video, and there are people decrying it as the worst thing since the Holocaust almost. hyperbole, okay? I know I'm over-exaggerating, but anyway, some people have really taken issue with that, and because of this one scene, because of a pose really that is overly sexualized, that ruins everything about it, and it should be nuked from orbit. There are a lot of other shows that are far more explicit that I don't see people having nearly as much issues about, like for instance Game of Thrones or other things like that, where there is so much sexualized content in those shows that I can't watch it, it's too much for me. This was one scene which was horrifying for the most part, and it established these creatures as terrible, and then that's kind of it. There's not much more, okay? So because there's so little of it, I can ignore it and actually appreciate so much of the other elements of this show that deconstruct classic fantasy tropes. Now, going back to the fact that this has been employed in other fantasies, let me give a great example to show that where this exists in other fantasy. Wheel of Time. I love Wheel of Time. It's like one of the greatest fantasies since Lord of the Rings, really. And look, right there. It's the entire Wheel of Time series, okay? And yes, they have in Wheel of Time, specifically the Murdral, okay? They're a type of monstrous creature that if they capture a woman, that's what they're gonna do. There is a specific scene where one of the bad guys, named the Forsaken, goes to meet the Great Lord of the Dark, okay? And he doesn't meet him, they talk. But anyway, he walks through the main area in which these monsters seem to be created, both the Trollocs, more on Trollocs later, and the Murdral, and he watches how the Murdral's blades are being made. There are women in cages or locked up, tied up, or anything like that, who have been repeatedly ravaged by the Murdral, okay? Horrifying enough. That's just, again, I'm going to explain why elements like this actually are important for establishing the monsters to be monstrous. You want your monsters to be monstrous in fantasy and stuff like that. So anyway, women there, that's what's happening to them. The Murdral are having their way with them constantly, and they are being kept alive for the sole purpose that when these blades are made, the final thing that needs to happen to give these blades the type of curse that they have, after they're being forged, they need to be quenched in the blood of these innocent women, okay? And so these creatures are making the blades, takes the blades, stabs them through the thing, and that's how the blades are quenched. This is horrifying, okay? Really, really dark stuff. And it's in one of the most beloved and prominent established fantasy stories that exist, Wheel of Time. Why does Wheel of Time do it, and why does Goblin Slayer have these monstrous type of elements in the story? One being the topic specifically that monsters have their way with innocent women. Well, it comes down to the whole reason why you want and sometimes need monsters in a story. You need a bad guy, you need an antagonist. Now, if your antagonist is a human, if you just make a person like a complete anarchist where they want to kill everyone for the sake of killing them and stuff like that, it can sometimes come off as very unrealistic because rarely are people like that. And our point of reference is we live in the world among people, and we know how rare such evil is to come across. It does exist sometimes, but when we find those unique examples of people so evil, there is always a very complex reason that has led them towards that. Now, sometimes it can just be there's something wrong in the head, but other times it can be a very complex thing. And so if you have a big antagonist that you want as a stable part of the story and to make them feel realistic, there's a lot of background work that as a writer you should do to establish this character to be the way they are. In actual fact, some of the best villains are the type of, in stories, are the type of villains who actually don't believe they're the villains. They feel they're doing the right thing, and that's when you get a really complex, dynamic villain if it's justified and done properly. Yet it's a lot of work. And so monsters can be used in storytelling as a type of almost literary shorthand to get the viciousness and evil without having to do so much of the work. This is just their nature. They are evil by design. Now, the usefulness about that is that you have an instant opposition to the heroes or whatever, where there is something bad and evil that needs to be killed. Now, killing evil is actually a good thing. We want to destroy evil, okay? But evil sometimes isn't nearly as rampant amongst the human race. Sometimes it is, okay? But sometimes it isn't nearly as rampant as what a story might need, okay? There is also the confronting reality that not every soldier that was part of a regime that we identify as purely evil was evil in and of themselves. There were many German soldiers that were actually fighting just to protect their nation because it went to war for reasons outside their control. Don't get me wrong, there were many horrible, horrible villains amongst the Germans during World War II, but there were also a lot of innocent men that were just caught up within the political turmoil of their times. But sometimes in stories, you actually don't want that level of complication. Sometimes you just want an enemy that is threatening the good guys, and there are no moral qualms about wiping out these monsters wholesale. Sometimes that level of complexity can add to a story, but in other times it can detract from what the main plot is, so you just need a kind of quick solution. And so to answer that, throw in monsters, okay? But there can be a problem, and that's if the monsters actually don't really feel threatening as monsters. And honestly, this is the problem that much fantasy has fallen into, especially with one of the most throwaway, disregarded, but yet most prominent monsters in all of fantasy, the Goblin, okay? Perfect example of this is the whole Lord of the Rings series and also the Hobbit series, which was underwhelming, well, more than underwhelming. Anyway, the Hobbit series, okay? Goblins are the main monster in these stories. And they never feel threatening, okay? They are so easy to kill, they're just basically bugs that the heroes stomp underfoot. Now, in larger numbers, the heroes have to run away, but they lack a menace, okay, a true threat. And one of the reasons is that you actually don't really see what these creatures will do if they win. And so that's where it falls apart. Many fantasy writers actually understand this. To really convey a true sense of menace to their monsters, they need to show what these monsters will do when they win. And so in the Wheel of Time series, they have a main staple monster that's far more numerous than the Myrddraal that I was describing previously. They have a creature called the Trollocs, and they can come in the hundreds of thousands at times. These things are everywhere when the bad guys really get their momentum going in this series. And they're large, brutish, muscular, humanoid-like creatures with animal heads, whether that be a pig, a wolf, or an eagle, or something like that. That's what they are. And to show the menace and vileness of these monsters, there are scenes in which Robert Jordan, the author of Wheel of Time, shows what these creatures will do when they have their way, and they eat people alive. And there are scenes where women and children are being boiled alive, and it's funny, it depends on how explicit you go. He doesn't, Robert Jordan, because of course, again, the nature of how explicit you want it, he doesn't actually show a viewpoint character being boiled alive, but he alludes to that. They're basically taken over town, and they have these people captured that they're taking along with them on their march to wherever they're going to fight. And these people that are taking with them is specifically their food source. These people know they're going to get eaten alive, and they have to watch every night certain numbers, and these could be family members, friends that grew up with because they're all from the same town, being boiled in these pots eaten alive. That's horrifying. Yet by even alluding to it, sometimes he doesn't show it extremely explicitly, but he references it and says this is what's happening. It creates such a horrifying menace to these monsters that it raises the stakes. You're actually engaged in these fights, that when these monsters start to get the upper hand and in a fight and stuff like that, you actually start to feel truly worried what could happen to these characters that you're invested in. So Goblin Slayer does that, but takes it a step further. And I actually feel the writer is kind of led this way by looking at a large plot hole that has existed in fantasy for quite a while regarding the cliche goblin. And it's that, how do they reproduce? Okay, it's an interesting yet rather crucial question. If you wanted to flesh out a monstrous creature and stuff like that to proper detail, that's an important question that honestly, I haven't seen any fantasy really address, acknowledge, or even explain. Now, it doesn't need to be explained the way that they've done it in Goblin Slayer, yet the path that they've chosen creates such a vile, menacing, evil nature to these creatures that even if they are weak, you want to slaughter them and make sure they are wiped off the face of the planet because they are so despicable in what they do. They will capture your women and children and impregnate them. That's how they reproduce in Goblin Slayer. They are kind of like a mutated form of human. There is no female gender to goblins, which is interesting because if you have a look at other fantasies, have you ever seen a female goblin? Look at the Lord of the Rings film. Not a single one. When I look at every single fantasy, everything, from Dungeons and Dragons to anything else, now, they might have this explained. I just haven't come across it. And I've come across a lot of fantasies I love this fantasy genre and stuff like that. Not once have I ever seen, or could think of, a female goblin. From Dragonlance to Dungeons and Dragons to Lord of the Rings. Now, it could be that there might be a goblin queen, kind of like, a bee queen that actually gives birth to all these goblins and there's only one and stuff like that. And that's another way you could explain it. Yet, by choosing this other way, instead of saying that you just never see them or they are hidden away in the goblin villages or whatever, which does actually strike me as a bit of a cop-out considering the amount of goblins we have seen in fantasy, these huge horde armies, and we've seen their home bases where they're all hanging out, preparing for their raids and things like that. You still never see female goblins in those. The writer of this fantasy has decided to actually run with that theme that you don't see female goblins because there's no such thing. They don't exist, and explained it with a mechanic that adds to their vile nature. Now, I have heard the argument and criticism lobbed against the Goblin Slayer that the only reason why the writer included this element as part of the goblin's nature was to be able to include titillating kind of gross imagery into the story, that overly sexualized pose that I've referred to. I don't know anything about the writer, so I'm not going to make that accusation. I won't discount the possibility that that could be the very reason why it exists in the manga. What I will say, if you were to take away that overly sexualized pose, and that's kind of the only one that exists in the anime, the manga's a different story, I actually find it a more realistic element that's been added to the goblin creature that makes them even more vile and hateful. And because that is actually what you want for a monster, I actually feel it to be quite effective and makes for a more engaging fantasy setting. And in actual fact, I kind of like realistic applications of fantasy so much that I probably would take it a step further to make them even more horrifying. And you don't need to show it explicitly in fantasy and stuff like that. But no, I would actually... It can go to, look, fantasy can be dark at some times, and even if you have this element in your fantasy, depending on how explicitly you show it, will vary the level of darkness. So you can have it and still not be nearly as dark as the true reality of this, if it was like. But I would have it be like this, that, yeah, goblins don't have a female in their species, and so that's how they reproduce. They have to steal women and impregnate them. But goblins, they grow fast, and they always are in large numbers. How do you explain their numbers, okay? Well, the way that you can explain that is that when they impregnate someone, they always have a litter, per se, of about 12 or so. But because there's so many growing, inside the womb, they cannot be delivered in the conventional manner. And so the way that they actually get delivered is by eating the mother alive from the inside. They're cannibals, they eat human flesh, so biologically it kind of works that they have these young creatures have a meal straight away ready to go, and it is horrifying beyond belief for any poor soul that has this done to you. Maybe, is it too horrifying? But this is the thing, and it comes to the question of why include in fantasy at all? Could you just exclude it completely? The fact that people are getting eaten alive is horrifying enough. Well, it adds a visceral element to it because the unfortunate, and it is truly unfortunate, we would wish that it never even happened. The unfortunate thing is that happens in real life. I wonder if the algorithm can even pick up the text. This video is getting demonetized. Okay, so the unfortunate reality is that it happens in real life today, okay? And it happened historically as well. And so if you're trying to approach something realistically, well, a general realistic result of really bad people when they capture women at their mercy, that is the unfortunate result. I also just want to say, and this might really upset some people, the fact that I think maybe it's the sensitive nature of the current climate, social climate I'm talking about the Me Too movement and stuff like that, in which people's, I guess, perspective on how bad certain things are have been a bit skewed. Now, I'm not saying this isn't horrifying beyond belief, it is, yet in Goblin Slayer, that act is not the most horrifying thing that happens to a character. This poor guy gets eaten alive. He gets slaughtered and eaten alive, and and it's funny, they allude to it like to almost the same level, though there is some overly explicit poses in Goblin Slayer, but you see the guy's hand and, blood flying off, he's screaming while getting beaten to death by a horde of goblins and eaten alive. Honestly, he came out of that situation a little bit worse than the other character that gets impregnated, because she actually survives. Now, emotionally traumatized for life, perhaps, but she has a chance to still recover from this horrifying thing and perhaps actually find happiness in life, and because she gets to live. This other guy gets, and no one has mentioned it. Not a single person has shed a tear. No one has given a stuff about this poor guy at all. Just kind of shows, I guess, what people's regard is in the modern day about, these kind of things. So Goblin Slayer really does achieve what I feel was the purpose of making the goblins so vile, okay? You hate them, you want to see them die. And I was so interested by this deconstruction of the fantasy genre that I actually looked at the manga and read further. And the problem that I had in the first episode was far more prevalent in the manga, okay? There is far more sexualized imagery of women being in very horrifying situations than I feel is appropriate. It's always very well-proportioned, attractive women who that happens to as well. So, look, there are issues there. The greater effect of what they were trying to do of establishing these monsters to being horrible was pulled off really, really well. And there is a lot of interesting, entertaining, and really cool elements about it as well. So if you want to check it out, be forewarned. There's some things that I honestly don't appreciate or think that it needs to be present at all. Yet there are creative and clever ways of taking a more realistic approach to very cliche fantasy elements, even just the larger thing about adventurers and taking on quests and stuff like that. The series really takes that trope that exists in fantasy video games, especially D&D and stuff like that, and then ask the questions, what would this really be like if we would take a more realistic approach? And because of that, I found it many elements very engaging and very creative, especially, and the Goblin Slayer character is hilarious. You'll notice that the characters don't have names. They're usually identified by their role. There's Goblin Slayer, Guild Girl, or something like that, Elf Ranger and things. And the Goblin Slayer character, he has no personality, and his only thing is about slaying goblins. And the way that they ham that up, it's actually kind of funny. So anyway, those are my thoughts on what can be a very controversial subject. And like I said, a very interesting kind of application of my whole fantasy rearmed series, looking at a different, sometimes, more realistic implementation of certain fantasy tropes. I certainly look forward to hearing your thoughts in the discussion below. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you next time. So until then, farewell.